By the mid-1960s, the civil rights movement had won legal victories, but for many Black Americans, daily life had not improved. Segregation was now illegal, but racism, poverty, and police brutality remained. In cities across the country, frustration turned to anger, and that anger erupted into violence. In August 1965, the Watts riots broke out in Los Angeles after a violent altercation between police and a Black motorist. For 6 days, chaos consumed the city. 34 people were killed, buildings were burned, and businesses were looted. The damage exceeded $40 million. It was the beginning of a wave of urban unrest. By 1967, there had been 125 uprisings across the United States. In Newark, 26 people died. In Detroit, more than 40 were killed. The nation was in crisis. In response, President Lyndon B. Johnson ordered an investigation. The result was the Kerner Report, published in 1968. It warned that America was becoming two separate societies, one Black, one white, divided and unequal. It blamed white racism, economic inequality, and police brutality for the riots. The report called for massive government investment in housing, education, and jobs. But when Richard Nixon became president in 1969, these recommendations were ignored. Instead, he focused on law and order, increasing police presence in Black communities and taking a harder stance on crime. Meanwhile, Martin Luther King Jr. had turned his focus to economic justice. In 1966, he launched the Chicago Campaign, hoping to tackle housing discrimination and poverty in the North. But the racism he encountered there was just as fierce as in the South. His peaceful marches were met with violent white mobs. The police did little to protect him, and city leaders refused to commit to real change. King later admitted that he had never seen such hatred as he had seen in Chicago. The campaign struggled, and some activists began to question whether nonviolence was still an effective strategy. Then, in April 1968, everything changed. King was in Memphis, Tennessee, supporting striking Black sanitation workers when he was assassinated by a white supremacist. News of his death spread quickly, and the nation erupted in grief and rage. In over 100 cities, riots broke out. Fires burned just blocks from the White House. The damage exceeded $70 million. It felt like the end of an era. After King's assassination, the civil rights movement changed. Some activists turned their focus to economic justice, while others embraced Black power and self-defense. The movement became more fragmented, and progress became slower. By 1975, some victories had been achieved. School segregation in the South had dramatically declined. More Black politicians had been elected, and government programs for minority businesses had been introduced. But racism had not disappeared. It had simply evolved into new forms. Economic inequality, discrimination, and police brutality remained deeply rooted in American society. At the same time, a new issue dominated American politics: the Vietnam War. The war drained government resources, shifting attention away from civil rights reforms. Many Black Americans opposed the war, believing that the fight for racial justice at home was more important than a foreign conflict. Yet, disproportionate numbers of Black soldiers were drafted and sent to fight in Vietnam. The cost of war also meant that federal funding for housing, education, and anti-poverty programs was reduced. As the 1970s began, civil rights leaders faced not only resistance from within the United States, but also the challenge of an administration more focused on war abroad than justice at home. The struggle for equality would continue, but the movement had changed. The next battle for civil rights would be fought in the shadow of Vietnam.